Hi, I'm Diana Hayes. Last Thanksgiving, my family gathered around our dining table and spent 2 hours tearing apart my life choices, laughing at my $20,000 salary, and telling me I was the family disappointment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They had no idea that while they were counting my failures, I was sitting on over $2 million that I'd earned entirely on my own. They thought they knew everything about me, but they didn't know anything at all. What happened next changed everything, and now they're the ones asking me for help. The whole disaster started on a Thursday evening in late November, when the first snow of the season was dusting the mountains outside Denver. I was finishing up my work at TechForward, a small nonprofit that builds educational software for underserved communities. The office was quiet except for the hum of old computers and the distant sound of traffic from downtown. I loved that silence, the way it wrapped around me while I wrote code that would actually help kids learn to read. My salary was embarrassingly low by Silicon Valley standards, but the work mattered to me in ways that stock options never could. My phone buzzed against my desk. A text from Mom. Family dinner Sunday, 5 sharp, don't be late like last time. No please, no question mark, just an expectation wrapped in maternal authority. I stared at the message longer than necessary, my stomach already tightening. Family dinners at the Hayes house had become exercises in endurance, elaborate performances, where everyone played their assigned roles. Kevin, the successful real estate broker with his luxury car and designer suits. Brittany, the Instagram influencer with her perfect marriage and sponsored lifestyle. And me, the charity case with her idealistic job and secondhand wardrobe. But they didn't know about the other life I lived after hours. The one where I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to check cryptocurrency markets in Tokyo. The one where I'd spent the last 4 years building and selling small applications that solved tiny problems for people who were willing to pay premium prices for elegant solutions. The one where my bank account grew steadily while I pretended to struggle with rent money. I'd started investing in Bitcoin back in college, throwing $20 bills at it whenever I could skip lunch or walk, instead of taking the bus. Everyone thought I was wasting money on internet fairy tales, but I understood the technology in ways that most people couldn't. When Bitcoin hit 40,000, I didn't sell. When it crashed to 20, I bought more. When it climbed to 60, I diversified into Ethereum and a few smaller cryptocurrencies that I'd researched obsessively. By the time my family was making jokes about my financial situation, I was quietly wealthier than all of them combined. The secret felt heavier some days than others. Sitting in my tiny apartment in Capitol Hill, eating ramen while watching my portfolio climb, I sometimes wondered what would happen if I just told them the truth. But something always stopped me. Maybe it was the way Kevin had smirked when I'd graduated with my computer science degree and taken the nonprofit job. Noble, he'd said, not meaning it as a compliment, but Noble doesn't pay the bills. Maybe it was how Brittany had introduced me to her friends as my sister who works for free, basically, followed by that laugh that wasn't quite mean enough to call cruel, but wasn't kind either. Or maybe it was Dad, who'd spent my entire childhood telling me that money was the only way to keep score in life, that everything else was just making excuses for losing. He'd built his insurance agency from nothing, and he wore that success like armor. Every conversation eventually circled back to earnings, to net worth, to who was winning and who was falling behind. In his world, my $20,000 salary made me a failure, regardless of what I was building on the side. Sunday arrived gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through every layer you think you're wearing. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home in Lakewood, parking behind Kevin's spotless BMW and Brittany's white Range Rover. The house looked the same as always, red brick and shutters, carefully maintained lawn that Dad paid someone else to keep perfect. Through the front window, I could see warm light and movement, the choreographed normalcy of a family that looked good from the outside. I sat in my car for an extra minute, listening to a podcast about emerging technologies and watching my breath fog the windows. My phone showed 3 new notifications from my cryptocurrency portfolio app, all gains from the morning's trading session. The numbers still felt surreal sometimes, like a video game score that might disappear if I looked away. Too long. But they were real, growing steadily while I sat there in my 8-year-old Honda with the passenger door that stuck when it rained. The front door opened before I could knock. Mom stood there in her good sweater, the navy one she saved for occasions when she wanted to look serious. Her smile was measured, the kind she wore when she was already bracing for disappointment. "Diana, you're here. Good. We were starting to worry you'd changed your mind." The living room felt smaller than I remembered, crowded with furniture. That had looked elegant when I was young but now seemed heavy and outdated. Kevin was sprawled across the leather recliner that Dad had claimed as his throne for as long as I could remember, scrolling through his phone with the casual arrogance of someone who belonged everywhere he went. Brittany sat curled on the sofa with her legs tucked under her, looking like she was posing for a lifestyle blog even in our parents' living room. "Diana." Brittany's voice carried that bright, artificial warmth that she used for her social media videos. "We were just talking about you. Kevin was telling us about this new development he's working on. Luxury condos starting at $800,000. Can you imagine?" I settled into the chair by the window, the one that had always been mine by default because nobody else wanted to sit with their back to the room. "Sounds impressive," I said, meaning it. Kevin was good at his job, even if he was insufferable about it. "The commission alone will cover my mortgage for the year," Kevin said without looking up from his phone. "Sometimes I forget what it's like to worry about money. Must be nice to remember, right, Diana?" There it was, the first little cut. Not deep enough to bleed, just sharp enough to sting. Dad emerged from the kitchen carrying a beer and a satisfied expression, like he'd already heard this conversation and approved of its direction. "Kevin's doing well," he announced, settling into his chair. "Both kids are, actually. Brittany just signed another brand partnership, something with kitchenware." "Sustainable cooking solutions," Brittany corrected, flashing her phone screen toward me. Her Instagram showed a perfectly arranged kitchen with copper pots and organic vegetables arranged like art. 60,000 followers now? The engagement rates are incredible. Mom appeared with a tray of appetizers, store-bought but arranged on her good plates. "I keep telling people about Diana's job," she said, setting the tray down with more force than necessary. "Working with computers, helping children. It's very noble." That word again. Noble. The way she said it made it sound like a consolation prize, something you gave to people who couldn't manage anything better. I picked up a piece of cheese and ate it slowly, buying time while I decided how much I wanted to engage with this familiar dance. "The nonprofit sector is important," I said carefully. "Not everything is about profit margins." Kevin finally looked up from his phone, grinning like I'd just proved his point. "Easy to say when you're not paying real bills. What are you making now, like 20,000? Before taxes?" The room went quiet except for the sound of the furnace kicking on. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my response, and I could feel the familiar heat rising in my chest. This was the moment where I usually deflected or changed the subject, where I played along with their script about my charming but impractical life choices. "Something like that," I said instead, keeping my voice level. "Jesus, Diana." Dad set down his beer harder than necessary. "I made more than that my first year selling insurance, and that was 30 years ago. What's your plan here? You can't live on good intentions forever." "She's following her passion," Mom said, but it sounded more like an apology than a defense. "Some people prioritize different things." "Like what?" Brittany asked, genuine curiosity in her voice for the first time all evening. "I mean, what's the end game?" You can't retire on $20,000 a year. You can't buy a house or start a family or do any of the things that actually matter in life. I looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA and my history, but understood nothing about who I'd become. They were so certain they knew my story, so confident in their version of my life that they couldn't see past their own assumptions. Part of me wanted to pull out my phone right then and show them my account balances, watch their expressions change as they processed numbers that would make Kevin's real estate commissions look like lunch money. But I didn't. Something held me back. Some instinct that this wasn't the right moment, or maybe that they weren't the right audience. Instead, I said, "I'm doing fine. Better than you think." "Are you, though?" Dad leaned forward, his expression shifting into the serious mode he used when he thought someone needed tough love. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're treading water. And treading water isn't swimming, Diana. It's just a slow way to drown." The conversation moved on to other topics after that, but the damage was done. Through dinner, as they discussed Kevin's latest sales numbers and Brittany's upcoming collaborations, I sat quietly and absorbed their casual dismissal of everything I'd chosen to do with my life. They weren't malicious, exactly. They genuinely believed they were trying to help, trying to wake me up to the reality of my situation. But their help felt like judgment, and their concern felt like condescension. After dinner, while Mom was clearing dishes and Dad was settling in to watch football, Brittany cornered me in the kitchen. Her voice dropped to the confidential tone she used when she wanted to seem caring instead of critical. "Diana, I hope you know we're not trying to gang up on you. We're worried, that's all. You're smart, you're talented, but you're not getting younger. At some point, you need to think practically about your future." I dried a plate slowly, considering my response. "What makes you think I'm not thinking about my future?" "Well, look at your job. Look at where you're living. Look at your car." She gestured toward the window where my Honda sat between their luxury vehicles like a poor relative at a wealthy wedding. "I'm not trying to be mean, but these things matter. Appearances matter. Success matters. Success means different things to different people," I said, but even as I said it, I could hear how defensive I sounded. "Does it, though? I mean, really?" Brittany pulled out her phone and showed me her banking app, scrolling past deposits from various brand partnerships. "This is what success looks like. This is freedom. The ability to choose what you want to do instead of just taking whatever job will have you." I almost laughed. If she only knew. But I just nodded and handed her another plate to put away. The drive home felt longer than usual, the familiar streets of Denver stretching endlessly under the streetlights. I kept replaying the conversation, hearing their voices echo in my head. $20,000. Noble but impractical. "What's your plan?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As if I didn't have a plan. As if I hadn't been executing a plan for years while they were busy judging the surface of my life. Back in my apartment, I made tea and opened my laptop. My portfolio dashboard glowed on the screen, showing numbers. That would have made Kevin choke on his beer and Brittany forget how to pose for Instagram. $2.3 million, spread across various investments but growing steadily month after month. My little nonprofit salary was just spending money, barely a fraction of what I earned from my side projects and investment returns. I'd built a small empire in the shadows while they were busy counting my failures in the light. And for the first time since dinner, I started to wonder what would happen if I stopped hiding it from them. The next morning at work, I found myself distracted during our weekly team meeting. My boss, Patricia Williams, was discussing our funding goals for the next quarter when she noticed I wasn't fully present. "Diana, you seem somewhere else today. Everything okay?" I looked around the conference room at my colleagues, good people who were passionate about education technology and making a difference in kids' lives. These were my people, I realized. Not the family that shared my last name, but couldn't see past their own definitions of success. Just thinking about some family stuff, I said. Family can be complicated, Patricia said with understanding. Take whatever time you need. But I didn't need time. I needed clarity. And sitting there in that meeting, surrounded by people who valued the work we were doing regardless of the salary it paid, I started to understand something important. My family's opinion of my choices said more about them than it did about me. They were so focused on conventional markers of success that they couldn't recognize unconventional achievement when it was sitting right in front of them. The question wasn't whether I should tell them about my secret wealth. The question was whether I wanted to keep pretending to be the person they thought I was, or whether I was ready to show them who I'd actually become. That weekend, I decided to drive up to Boulder to clear my head. The mountain air always helped me think, and I needed space away from the echo of my family's voices. I parked near the Flatirons and walked one of the easier trails, letting the rhythm of my steps quiet the noise in my mind. The cryptocurrency markets were having a good week, and my phone kept buzzing with notifications of small gains that added up to more than most people made in months. Halfway up the trail, I sat on a boulder and pulled out my phone. My investment app showed another $2,000 gain since morning. I screenshot the number, then deleted it immediately. Who was I going to show it to? My family would never believe it came from legitimate sources. My coworkers would wonder why I was working for peanuts if I had this kind of money. The secret felt heavier in the mountains, surrounded by all that space and silence. A text from Marcus Thompson appeared on my screen. Marcus was someone I'd met at a tech meetup 6 months earlier, a software engineer who worked for a startup downtown. We'd been grabbing coffee occasionally, nothing serious, just conversations about coding and cryptocurrency and the weird intersection between technology and human behavior. He was one of the few people who knew about my side projects, though not about the full extent of my portfolio. Coffee later? I have something interesting to show you. I texted back that I'd meet him at our usual place, a small cafe in Reno that served excellent espresso and minded its own business. Marcus was waiting when I arrived, his laptop open and a familiar, excited expression on his face. He was the kind of person who got genuinely enthusiastic about elegant code solutions, which was one of the things I liked about him. I've been working on something, he said without preamble. Remember that conversation we had about micropayment systems for content creators? I think I figured out a way to make it work. He turned his laptop toward me, showing a clean interface that looked deceptively simple. But as he walked me through the back-end architecture, I could see the sophisticated thinking behind it. The system would allow people to make tiny payments for individual articles, videos, or other content without the friction of traditional payment processing. This is smart, I said, meaning it. Have you tested it with real users? That's where I need help. I need someone who understands both the technical side and the business side. Someone who gets how people actually behave with money online. I stared at the screen, seeing possibilities that Marcus probably hadn't even considered yet. The payment processing alone could generate serious revenue if scaled properly. And the data insights from micropayment patterns could be valuable to content platforms and advertisers. What kind of help? I asked carefully. Partnership, maybe. I handle the technical development. You handle the business strategy and user experience design. Split everything 50-50. It was a generous offer, more generous than Marcus realized. I could fund the entire development process myself without touching my cryptocurrency holdings, just from my cash reserves. But I was intrigued by the possibility of working with someone who saw me as an equal partner, not as the disappointing family member who couldn't get her life together. Let me think about it, I said. We talked for another hour, diving deep into technical specifications and market analysis. Marcus had done his homework, but I could see gaps in his business model that my experience with payment systems and user behavior could fill. By the time we left the cafe, I was already sketching out ideas for how to make his concept work on a larger scale. That night, I sat in my apartment making lists. Not just about Marcus's project, but about everything. My job at TechForward, my investment portfolio, my family relationships, my future plans. I was living 3 different lives, and none of them were talking to each other. The nonprofit worker who cared about social impact, the secret millionaire who played cryptocurrency markets, the disappointed daughter who let her family believe she was failing. The contradiction was exhausting. I loved my work at TechForward, but I was starting to realize that I could have more impact with more resources. My side projects were generating real income, but I was treating them like hobbies instead of legitimate businesses. And my family situation was just getting worse the longer I let them operate with incomplete information about who I really was. Monday morning brought a new crisis at work. Our main grant funding was being cut by 40%, which meant layoffs were inevitable. Patricia called an emergency meeting, and I could see the stress written across her face as she explained the situation to our small team. "We're going to have to make some difficult decisions," she said. "I'm hoping to keep everyone on, but hours will be reduced significantly. I know this isn't what anyone wants to hear." I looked around the room at my colleagues, good people who were passionate about the work but couldn't afford to take major pay cuts. Sarah Chen, our lead designer, was supporting her elderly parents. Jake Rodriguez had student loans that consumed half his already modest salary. Mary Kim was a single mother with childcare costs that barely made sense, even with her current income. After the meeting, Patricia pulled me aside. "I'm sorry, Diana. I know you're already making sacrifices to work here. If you need to look for something that pays better, I'll understand completely." The irony was almost painful. Here was my boss apologizing for not being able to pay me enough money, while my phone was buzzing with notifications about investment gains that exceeded her annual salary. But Patricia didn't know that, and her concern was genuine. "What if there was another way?" I asked. "What do you mean?" I took a breath, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. What if TechForward had a major donor? Someone who believed in the mission enough to fund operations for the next few years? Patricia's expression shifted from confusion to cautious hope. That would change everything, obviously. But donors like that don't just appear out of nowhere. We've been applying for grants and reaching out to foundations for months. "Sometimes they do," I said quietly. "Let me make some calls." That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I called my financial advisor, David Kim, and told him I wanted to make a significant charitable donation, not just a tax-deductible gift, but a real investment in an organization that mattered to me. "How significant?" David asked. "Enough. To fund TechForward's operations for 3 years, maybe 500,000. There was silence on the other end of the line. David had been managing part of my portfolio for 2 years, but we'd never discussed philanthropy on this scale. "That's a substantial commitment, Diana. Are you sure you've thought this through?" I had. I'd been thinking about it all morning, all weekend, maybe for months without realizing it. The money was sitting in accounts earning modest returns while people I cared about were worried about losing their jobs. Meanwhile, my family was lecturing me about financial responsibility while they played status games with luxury cars and brand partnerships. "I'm sure," I said. "How quickly can we make it happen?" David walked me through the process: donor-advised funds, tax implications, documentation requirements. It would take a few days to set up properly, but the money could be transferred to TechForward within a week. After I hung up, I sat in my car outside the office building, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. I'd just committed to giving away more money than my family thought I'd ever seen in my lifetime. And it felt right in a way that hoarding cryptocurrency gains never had. Patricia was in her office when I knocked, staring at spreadsheets with the grim expression of someone trying to make impossible numbers work. "I have good news," I said. "That donor I mentioned, they're interested, very interested. Her head snapped up. Seriously? How do you know someone with that kind of money? It's complicated, I said, which was true enough. But they want to remain anonymous. The donation will come through a donor-advised fund, completely legitimate. No strings attached except that they believe in what we're doing here. Patricia leaned back in her chair, looking like she might cry from relief. How much? $500,000, maybe more if the program shows results. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process the information. Diana, this is incredible. Life-changing. How did you even connect with someone like that? Tech circles, I said vaguely. Sometimes people with money want to support grassroots education initiatives. They just need to know the right organizations exist. It wasn't technically a lie. I was someone with money who wanted to support grassroots education initiatives. I just happened to be sitting right in front of her. The rest of the week passed in a blur of paperwork and logistics. David worked with TechForward's financial team to structure the donation properly. Patricia started making plans for expanded programming and maybe even hiring additional staff. My colleagues went from worried to cautiously optimistic to genuinely excited as word spread about our mysterious benefactor. And I kept my mouth shut, playing the role of the lucky employee who happened to know someone generous. It was easier than explaining the truth, but also more complicated. Every thank you felt like a small deception. Every expression of gratitude reminded me that I was living a double life. Friday evening, Marcus called with an update on his micropayment system. He'd been coding non-stop all week, refining the user interface and stress testing the payment. Processing. I keep thinking about our conversation, he said. About partnership. Are you still interested? More than interested, I said. I want to do this right. Serious investment, proper business structure, real market research, not just a side project. That sounds expensive. I have some resources, I said carefully. Not huge amounts, but enough to get us started properly. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Diana, can I ask you something? And I want you to be honest with me. My stomach clenched. Sure. What's your actual situation? Financially, I mean. Because sometimes you talk like someone who's been poor forever, and sometimes you talk like someone who understands money in ways that don't match your nonprofit salary. It was a fair question, and Marcus had earned an honest answer. We'd been building trust over months of conversations, and he'd never judged me for my choices or my family situation. It's complicated, I said finally. I make good money from side projects. App development, some consulting work. More than my day job, actually. But I keep it quiet because people make assumptions. What kind of assumptions? That if you have money, you can't care about social impact. That working at a nonprofit when you don't have to is somehow fake or performative. My family already thinks I'm wasting my potential. If they knew I was choosing to make $20,000 a year, when I could make more, they'd never understand. Marcus was quiet again, processing. How much more? Enough that I'd just funded TechForward's operations for the next 3 years. You're the anonymous donor. Yeah. Jesus, Diana. That's not side project money. That's serious wealth. I took a deep breath. I've been investing in cryptocurrency since college. Started small, got lucky with timing, reinvested carefully, and the app development business has been better than I expected. People pay premium prices for software that solves real problems. How serious are we talking? Serious enough that money isn't really a limiting factor for business decisions anymore. Marcus was quiet for so long that I wondered if I'd made a mistake telling him. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not angry, but more careful. Why didn't you tell me before? Because every time I tell people, things change. They either start treating me differently, or they start asking for things, or they decide I'm not the person they thought I was. I liked that you saw me as an equal partner, not as a source of funding. You are an equal partner. Maybe more than equal, actually. I'm bringing ideas and technical skills. You're bringing business expertise and capital. That's a pretty valuable combination. So we're still doing this? Absolutely. But I want to do it right. Real contracts, real business structure, real equity split based on actual contributions. I don't want your money, Diana. I want your partnership. That night, I found myself thinking about partnerships and equality and the difference between being needed for what you could provide versus being wanted for who you were. My family needed me to be unsuccessful so they could feel superior. Marcus wanted me to be successful so we could build something together. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Saturday morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. Mom's contact photo appeared on the screen, and I almost didn't answer. Our family dinners had been strained enough lately without adding midweek check-ins. Diana, honey, I have some news. Her tone was carefully neutral, which usually meant drama was coming. Dad's been talking to his friend Tom at the insurance agency. They have an entry-level position opening up. Good benefits, room for advancement, starting salary around $45,000. I set down my coffee cup harder than necessary. Mom, I have a job. I know, but this would be a real career, with a future. Tom said he'd be willing to interview you based on Dad's recommendation. What makes you think I want to sell insurance? What makes you think you don't? Diana, you're smart enough to do anything you want, but you have to want something that actually pays the bills. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Mom alternating between concern and frustration while I tried to explain that I was happy with my current work. She couldn't understand why someone would choose to make less money, and I couldn't explain my real financial situation without opening a conversation I wasn't ready to have. After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at my investment portfolio on my phone. The numbers kept growing, slowly but steadily, like a plant that nobody was watering but refused to die. My cryptocurrency holdings alone were worth more than Dad's insurance agency had generated in profit over the past 3 years. My app development income exceeded Kevin's real estate commissions in most months. And my anonymous donation to TechForward represented more liquid capital than Brittany would see from her influencer career over the next decade. But they didn't know any of that. They were still operating under the assumption that I was the family failure, the one who needed guidance and intervention and job opportunities from Dad's friends. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. I was living proof that their assumptions about money and success were wrong, but I was keeping that proof hidden from the people who most needed to see it. Marcus texted me that afternoon with a business plan outline for our micropayment platform. He'd done serious research over the weekend, including competitive analysis and projected user acquisition costs. Reading through his notes, I could see that he understood both the technical challenges and the market opportunity. "This is solid work," I texted back. "Want to meet Monday and talk about next steps?" "Definitely. I've been thinking about what you said. About partnerships and equality. I want to make sure we structure this right from the beginning." Monday's meeting with Marcus felt different from our casual coffee conversations. We sat in a conference room at a co-working space downtown, with notebooks and laptops and the focused energy of people who were ready to build something real. "I've been thinking about equity structure," Marcus said, sliding a sheet of paper across the table. 50-50 feels right for decision-making, but I want to account for different types of contributions. His proposal was more sophisticated than I'd expected. He'd researched startup equity models and legal structures, thinking through scenarios I hadn't considered. It was clear he'd been taking this seriously, treating it as a real business venture rather than a hobby project. "This looks fair," I said, reviewing his notes. "What about funding?" "I can cover initial development costs," Marcus said. "Server hosting, legal fees, basic marketing, maybe $10,000 to get started properly." I nodded, but I was already thinking bigger. $10,000 would cover the basics, but serious market penetration would require real investment in user acquisition and platform development. With my resources, we could skip the bootstrapping phase entirely and launch at scale. What if we started with more capital? I asked. Enough to do real market testing, hire freelance developers, maybe even bring on a marketing specialist. Marcus looked interested but cautious. How much more? 100,000. Maybe 200 if we want to move fast. Diana, that's a huge risk. What if the platform doesn't work? What if we can't find product market fit? Then we learn something expensive and move on to the next idea. But if we're right about the market opportunity, having adequate funding could make the difference between slow growth and real success. We spent 2 hours working through business models and growth projections. Marcus had the technical vision, but I could see market opportunities that his engineering background hadn't prepared him to recognize. The micropayment system could expand beyond content creators into digital services, online education, even cryptocurrency transactions. By the end of the meeting, we had a timeline and a budget. Marcus would handle technical development while I managed business strategy and funding. Equal partners in decision-making, but with complementary skills that made the partnership stronger than either of us would be alone. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about the future that wasn't tied to watching numbers grow on investment apps. I was going to build something real with someone who saw my potential instead of my limitations. And for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I wasn't thinking about my family's opinions at all. Spring arrived in Denver with unexpected warmth, and with it came the first real test of everything Marcus and I had been building. Our micropayment platform, which we'd named FlowPay, was finally ready for beta testing. 3 months of intense development had produced something elegant and functional, a system that could process tiny transactions with minimal friction, while providing detailed analytics to content creators. Marcus had been right about the technical challenges. Building a payment system that could handle thousands of microtransactions per minute without crushing users with fees required innovative architecture and careful optimization. But I'd been right about the market opportunity. Our early beta testers were reporting engagement rates that traditional payment processors couldn't match. The morning of our first major pitch meeting, I stood in my apartment bathroom applying makeup and trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building for weeks. We were meeting with venture capital firm Morrison Partners, and their initial interest had been encouraging enough that Marcus and I had spent 2 weeks perfecting our presentation. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Ready to change the world? I smiled despite my nerves. His enthusiasm was infectious, and over the past few months, I'd started to remember what it felt like to be genuinely excited about work instead of just dutiful about it. Building FlowPay had reminded me why I'd fallen in love with technology in the first place. The ability to solve real problems with elegant code, to create systems that made people's lives measurably better. The Morrison Partners office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, all polished concrete and minimalist design that screamed expensive consulting fees. Marcus was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, looking sharp in a navy suit that he'd bought specifically for investor meetings. "You clean up nice," I said, adjusting his tie slightly. "Brittany would be so proud," he replied, then immediately looked apologetic. "Sorry, I know things with your family are complicated." He wasn't wrong. Over the past few months, as FlowPay had consumed more of my time and attention, my family's concern about my career choices had evolved into something closer to intervention. Kevin had started sending me job listings from his real estate network. Brittany had offered to help me build my personal brand through social media. Mom called weekly with updates about opportunities in Dad's business circles. They meant well, I think. But their help felt suffocating, like being rescued from drowning by people who couldn't see that you were actually swimming. The Morrison Partners conference room overlooked downtown Denver, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city where I'd been quietly building my secret empire. Sarah Morrison, The founding partner was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-30s with sharp eyes and an expensive haircut that suggested she took herself very seriously. "Tell me about FlowPay," she said without preamble, settling into her chair with the confidence of someone who heard dozens of pitches every month. Marcus took the lead on the technical presentation, walking through our architecture and security features with the kind of detail that impressed engineers but sometimes lost business audiences. But Sarah stayed engaged, asking thoughtful questions about scalability and user experience that showed she understood both the technology and the market. When it was my turn to discuss business strategy, I felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from knowing my numbers inside and out. I'd spent weeks researching comparable platforms, analyzing user behavior patterns, and projecting growth scenarios under different funding levels. The micropayment market is fragmented right now, I explained, clicking through slides that showed market gaps and competitive positioning. Existing solutions are either too expensive for small transactions or too complicated for average users. FlowPay solves both problems while providing creators with insights they can't get anywhere else. Sarah leaned forward. "What's your user acquisition strategy?" "Content creator partnerships initially, but with rapid expansion into adjacent markets. Online education, digital services, subscription management. The platform is designed to handle any scenario where someone wants to pay small amounts for digital value. And you think there's venture scale opportunity in micropayments?" "I think micropayments are going to be fundamental to the next generation of internet commerce. Right now, users either get content for free with advertising, or they pay monthly subscriptions for platforms they might not use regularly. Micropayments create a middle path where people pay for what they actually consume." We talked for another hour, diving deep into technical specifications and business projections. Sarah asked hard questions about customer acquisition costs and churn rates, market penetration timelines, and competitive threats. But she also asked about our vision for the platform's future, about the problems we were trying to solve and the impact we hoped to have. By the end of the meeting, I could tell she was genuinely interested, not just politely engaged, but actively, calculating whether FlowPay could generate the kind of returns that venture capital firms needed to justify their investments. "We'll be in touch within the week," Sarah said as we gathered our materials. "This is impressive work, both the technology and the business thinking." Outside the building, Marcus and I walked aimlessly through downtown, both too wired from adrenaline to head back to our respective offices immediately. "I think that went well," Marcus said. "Better than well, actually." She seemed genuinely excited about the platform. "She did," I agreed. "But I want to be prepared for other scenarios, too. Venture capital is competitive, and we're still an early-stage startup with limited traction." "What other scenarios?" I'd been thinking about this for weeks, actually. Morrison Partners would be ideal because of their connections and expertise, but they weren't our only option. With my personal resources, we could fund the next phase of development ourselves, maintaining complete control over the platform's direction and equity structure. "We could bootstrap longer," I said carefully. "Take smaller investments from angel investors, or even self-fund if we needed to." Marcus stopped walking and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Diana, how much money do you actually have?" It was a fair question, and one that I'd been avoiding answering directly for months. Our partnership had been built on mutual respect and complementary skills, but we'd never had a completely honest conversation about the financial resources I could bring to the table. "Enough," I said. "Enough that if Morrison Partners passes, or if their terms aren't acceptable, we have other options." That's not really an answer. We were standing on a quiet corner near the state capitol, afternoon sunlight filtering through the trees that lined the sidewalks. Marcus deserved honesty, especially if we were going to continue building something together. "I have about $2.5 million in liquid assets," I said quietly. "Cryptocurrency investments, app development income, some traditional investments. Enough to fund FlowPay completely if we wanted to maintain control. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. Why are you working at TechForward? Because the work matters. To me. Because I believe in what we're doing there. Because having money doesn't mean you stop caring about impact. But you could do anything. Start any company, invest in any opportunity, live anywhere you wanted. I am doing what I want, I said. Building FlowPay with you, supporting TechForward's mission, investing in things that matter to me. Having money just means I get to choose based on what I care about instead of what pays the bills. We walked in silence for a few more blocks, both lost in our own thoughts. I wondered if I'd made a mistake telling him the truth. Money changed things, even when you didn't want it to. People started treating you differently, seeing opportunities instead of partnerships, resources instead of relationships. Diana, Marcus said finally, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything for me. About our partnership, I mean. You're still the smartest business strategist I know, and FlowPay is still a better platform because of your insights. The money is just money. But even as he said it, I could see him recalculating our relationship. Not in a mercenary way, but with the natural adjustment that happens when you realize someone you thought you knew has been operating at a completely different level than you understood. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the Morrison Partners presentation and thinking about disclosure and authenticity. Telling Marcus about my financial situation had felt necessary and right, but it had also shifted something subtle in our dynamic. He was being careful with me now in ways he hadn't been before, more deferential to my opinions, more conscious of the power imbalance that money created. My phone rang while I was making dinner. Kevin's contact photo appeared on the screen, and I debated letting it go to voicemail. But family calls in the evening usually meant something important, so I answered. Diana, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be straight with me. His tone was serious, more serious than our usual conversations about my career disappointments and his real estate successes. Okay. Brittany was at some networking event today, talking to people in the tech industry. Someone mentioned a company called FlowPay, said it was founded by a Diana Hayes. That's not you, is it? My stomach dropped. I'd been careful to keep my startup activities separate from my family life, but Denver's tech community was smaller than I'd realized. Word was starting to spread about FlowPay, especially after our Morrison Partners meeting. Why would you think it's not me? Because you work at that nonprofit for $20,000 a year, because you drive a Honda with a broken door handle, because you live in that tiny apartment and eat ramen for dinner. People don't just secretly start companies, Diana. I took a deep breath. Actually, they do, all the time. So it is you. Yes. There was silence on Kevin's end, and I could practically hear him trying to process this information. In his world, business success was visible and measurable. You drove expensive cars and lived in impressive houses and made sure everyone knew how well you were doing. The idea that someone could be building something significant while appearing to struggle financially didn't fit his understanding of how success worked. How is that even possible? Starting a company costs money, real money. I've been doing app development on the side for years. It pays better than you might think. How much better? Better enough. Diana, this is crazy. Why didn't you tell us? Why are you still working at that nonprofit if you have a real business? Because both things matter to me. TechForward's mission is important, and FlowPay is important, and they're not mutually exclusive. Kevin was quiet again, and I could sense his frustration. He wanted simple explanations, clear categories, obvious cause and effect relationships. The idea that someone could have complex motivations that didn't reduce to pure financial optimization was genuinely confusing to him. I'm going to tell Mom and Dad, he said finally. Kevin, please don't. Not yet. FlowPay is still in early stages, and I don't want to deal with family drama while we're trying to close our first funding round. Family drama? Diana, this is good news. Great news. Mom and Dad have been worried about you for years. They think you're wasting your potential. And now they'll think I've been lying to them. Haven't you been? It was a fair point, one that I'd been wrestling with for months. The line between privacy and deception had blurred gradually, until I wasn't sure which side I was on anymore. I've been protecting my privacy, I said. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been letting us worry about you while you were actually doing fine. Better than fine, apparently. After we hung up, I knew I had maybe 48 hours before the rest of my family found out about FlowPay. Kevin meant well, but he'd never been able to keep information to himself, especially information that changed how he understood other people. I called Marcus, needing to talk through the implications with someone who understood both the business and the family dynamics. They're going to find out eventually, he said after I explained the situation. Might be better coming from you than from industry gossip. I know. I just wanted to control the timing. Let FlowPay get established before dealing with family expectations and opinions. What kind of expectations? That if I'm successful, I should be successful in ways they recognize. Expensive car, big house, obvious status symbols. They won't understand why I'm still working at TechForward if FlowPay is generating real revenue. Are you going to quit TechForward? It was a question I'd been avoiding, even in my own mind. My anonymous donation had stabilized TechForward's finances, but the organization would be fine without me. Patricia had hired 2 new developers with the additional funding, and my role was becoming less critical to daily operations. I don't know, I said honestly. I love the work, but FlowPay is going to need more attention as we scale. And there are other projects I want to explore, other ways to use technology for social impact. What kind of projects? I'd been researching financial inclusion technologies, systems that could help underbanked populations access digital services without traditional credit infrastructure. The kind of work that TechForward's mission supported, but at a scale that required significant capital investment. Cryptocurrency-based microfinance platforms, digital identity systems for refugees and undocumented immigrants, educational technology for rural areas without reliable internet infrastructure. Problems that need both technical solutions and serious funding. Problems that someone with your resources could actually solve. Problems that someone with my resources and your technical skills could solve, I corrected. I'm not interested in being a solo philanthropist. I want to build things with people who share the vision. We talked for another hour about technology and social impact, about the responsibilities that came with having resources and the opportunities that came with having skills. By the end of the conversation, I felt clearer about my priorities and more confident about the choices I was making. But I also knew that clarity wouldn't make the coming family conversation any easier. Wednesday morning brought the call I'd been expecting. Mom's voice was tight with emotion when I answered, the controlled tone she used when she was trying not to yell. Diana, we need to talk. All of us. Tonight. Mom, I can explain. I'm sure you can. 7 o'clock. Don't be late. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy and strategic planning. I knew my family well enough to predict their reactions, but I also knew that this conversation would fundamentally change our relationships. Once they understood my real financial situation, everything would be different. Sarah Morrison called that afternoon with news about FlowPay. Morrison Partners was interested in leading a Series A funding round, pending due diligence and final term negotiations. It was exactly the outcome Marcus and I had been hoping for, validation that our platform had real commercial potential. But as I listened to Sarah discuss valuation multiples and board composition, I found myself thinking about family dynamics and the weight of expectations. In a few hours, I would be sitting around the same dining table where they'd mocked my $20,000 salary, explaining that I'd been quietly building something worth millions while they were busy judging my life choices. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to close the biggest business deal of my life, and all I could think about was how to explain myself to people who had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I was capable of. Marcus texted me that evening as I was getting ready to drive to Lakewood. "Good luck tonight. Remember that you don't owe them an explanation for being successful." He was right, of course, but family relationships operated by different rules than business partnerships. In business, results spoke for themselves. In families, the story mattered as much as the outcome. I arrived at my parents' house to find all the usual cars in the driveway, plus Tom Morrison's pickup truck. Tom was Dad's business partner, which meant this wasn't just a family meeting. This was going to be a performance, a demonstration of how successful people handled business discussions. The living room felt smaller than usual, crowded with people and expectations. Dad sat in his usual chair, but his posture was different, more formal. Mom perched on the edge of the sofa like she was ready to jump up at any moment. Kevin lounged against the wall with his arms crossed, trying to look casual but failing to hide his curiosity. Brittany sat with her phone out, probably planning to document this family drama for her social media audience. And Tom Morrison sat, in the chair that was usually mine, taking up space like he belonged there. "Diana," Dad said without preamble, "we hear you've been keeping secrets." The silence in my parents' living room stretched long enough for me to hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the same clock that had marked uncomfortable family moments throughout my childhood. Tom Morrison's presence made everything feel more formal, like this was a business negotiation rather than a family conversation. His weathered hands were folded in his lap, and his expression carried the patient authority of someone who had mediated disputes for decades. "I haven't been keeping secrets," I said finally, settling into the only remaining chair. "I've been building something." Dad's eyebrows rose slightly. "Building something worth millions, apparently. Kevin says you founded some tech company that's getting attention from venture capitalists. FlowPay. It's a micropayment platform for digital content creators. And you've been working on this while pretending to struggle on $20,000 a year?" Mom's voice had an edge I rarely heard, the tone she used when she felt personally betrayed. "I haven't been pretending anything. I do work at TechForward for $20,000 a year. I also run FlowPay with my business partner. Both things are true." Brittany looked up from her phone with genuine confusion. "But why would you keep working for practically nothing if you have a real business? That doesn't make any sense." Tom Morrison cleared his throat, drawing attention to himself with practiced ease. "Diana, your father asked me to sit in on this conversation because I have some experience with family businesses and financial planning. What they're struggling to understand is why someone would maintain the appearance of financial difficulty while building substantial assets." The way he phrased it made my choices sound deliberately deceptive, like I'd been running some kind of elaborate con game on my own family. I could see how it looked from their perspective, but I also resented the implication that I owed them complete transparency about my financial decisions. "I wasn't maintaining any appearance," I said. "I was living my life according to my own priorities. TechForward does important work that I believe in. FlowPay is a separate project that I'm passionate about. Having money from one doesn't negate the value of the other." "But it does change things," Dad said. "It changes how we understand your choices, your situation, your future plans. We've been worrying about you for years, thinking you were struggling, offering help and opportunities. Meanwhile, you were apparently doing better than any of us." Kevin pushed off from the wall and started pacing behind the sofa. "That's what I don't get. If you're doing so well, why let us think you needed help? Why not just tell us you were successful?" "Because this is exactly what I knew would happen," I said, gesturing around the room. "The moment you found out I had money, Everything changed. Now we're having a formal family meeting with Dad's business partner to discuss my financial decisions, like they're somehow your business too. They are our business, Mom said sharply. We're your family. Your success reflects on all of us, just like your struggles would. Does it? Because when you thought I was struggling, you were pretty clear about how disappointing that reflection was. The words came out harder than I'd intended, but they'd been building pressure for months. All those dinners where they'd dissected my life choices, all those conversations about my wasted potential, all those helpful suggestions about how I should be living differently. Brittany set down her phone and leaned forward. Diana, that's not fair. We were trying to help you. We were worried about your future. Were you worried about my future or were you embarrassed by my present? Both, honestly, Kevin said, stopping his pacing to look directly at me. It was hard watching you struggle when we all knew you were smart enough to do better. And, yes, it was embarrassing when people asked about my sister who worked for charity wages. At least he was being honest. I could work with honesty, even when it stung. Tom Morrison spoke up again, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who was used to facilitating difficult conversations. Diana, I think what your family is trying to understand is the communication issue here. In business, when partners or stakeholders have incomplete information, it creates problems. Trust issues, strategic misalignments, missed opportunities. This isn't a business relationship, I said. This is a family. Family businesses are still businesses, he replied. And families with significant assets need to coordinate their financial strategies. I stared at him, suddenly understanding why Dad had invited him to this conversation. This wasn't just about flow pay or my secret success. This was about bringing me into the family's financial planning discussions, treating me as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be understood. What kind of coordination are you talking about? I asked carefully. Dad leaned forward, his expression shifting into the serious mode he used for important business discussions. Tax planning, investment strategies, estate planning. If you're generating the kind of income Kevin mentioned, there are ways to optimize our family's overall financial position. Our family's financial position? Wealth management is more effective when it's coordinated across related parties, Tom Morrison explained. Shared investments, tax loss harvesting, charitable giving strategies. Your success could benefit everyone if it's managed properly. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. They weren't angry about my secrecy. They were excited about my money. All this concern about communication and trust was really about access and control. How much are we talking about? Mom asked. Kevin said you mentioned having enough to fund your business completely, but that could mean anything. I looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA and my history, but seemed to understand nothing about my motivations or values. 6 months ago, they'd been lecturing me about financial responsibility. Now they wanted to integrate my assets into their family wealth management strategy. Why does the exact amount matter? Because it determines what kind of planning we need to do, Dad said. If you're talking about hundreds of thousands, that's one conversation. If you're talking about millions, that's a completely different level of financial complexity. And opportunity, Kevin added. Diana, if you really have serious money, we could pool resources for bigger investments. Real estate developments, business acquisitions, diversified portfolios. You're thinking too small with this tech startup thing. The tech startup thing is generating more revenue than your real estate commissions, I said quietly. The room went silent again. Kevin's face flushed, and I could see him calculating whether I was being defensive or stating a fact. How much more? He asked. Significantly more. Brittany was staring at me like I'd revealed I was secretly a movie star. Diana, are you rich? Like, actually rich? Define rich. Enough to buy a house without a mortgage. Enough to travel anywhere you want. Enough to never worry about money again. I nodded slowly. Yeah, that kind of rich. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tensions. This was processing silence, the quiet that comes when people are fundamentally recalibrating their understanding of a situation. Tom Morrison was the first to speak. Diana, with assets at that level, you really should be working with professional wealth managers. Tax implications alone could be costing you hundreds of thousands per year if you're not structuring things properly. I have financial advisors. Family wealth management is different from individual planning, he continued. There are strategies available to high net worth families that can benefit everyone involved. Such as? Dad took over the explanation, his voice warming with the enthusiasm he always showed when discussing profitable opportunities. Charitable trusts that provide tax benefits while supporting causes you care about. Investment partnerships that spread risk while maximizing returns. Even simple things like coordinated major purchases can save significant money through Group B. Negotiating power. I listened to him outline various strategies for optimizing family wealth, most of which involve treating individual assets as components of a larger financial portfolio. It was logical and probably profitable, but it also felt like being absorbed into something I'd never agreed to join. What would this look like practically? I asked. Regular family financial meetings, Mom said. Coordinated decision-making. On major expenses and investments. Shared financial planning with professional advisors who understand the full picture. And in exchange? In exchange? Kevin looked confused. Diana, this isn't a negotiation. This is family. We share resources and opportunities because that's what families do. Is it? Because 6 months ago, when you thought I didn't have resources, you weren't particularly interested in sharing yours. That's different, Brittany said. You were struggling then. Now you're successful. Of course the dynamic changes. Her honesty was refreshing, even if it confirmed everything I'd suspected about their motivations. When I was poor, I needed their help and guidance. Now that I was wealthy, they needed my resources and cooperation. Tom Morrison pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted several printed documents. I took the liberty of preparing some preliminary analysis based on what Kevin told us about your situation. These are some potential structures that could benefit everyone involved. He spread the papers across the coffee table, showing charts and graphs that illustrated various wealth management strategies. The documents were professional and thorough, clearly prepared by someone who understood high-level financial planning. You prepared these before talking to me? I asked. I wanted to be ready to provide concrete options rather than just theoretical discussions, he said. Time is money at your income level, Diana. Every day you delay proper wealth management is money lost to inefficient tax strategies and suboptimal investment allocation. I studied the documents, recognizing some of the strategies from my own research into tax optimization and asset protection. The proposals were legitimate and probably profitable, but they all assumed I wanted to merge my financial planning with my family's existing strategies. These are impressive, I said finally, but they're all based on the assumption that I want to coordinate my wealth management with yours. Why wouldn't you want that? Dad asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Because 6 months ago you were embarrassed by my life choices. Because you spent years treating my career like a phase I'd grow out of. Because you invited your business partner to a family conversation without asking if I was comfortable with that. Diana, that's not fair, Mom said. We've always supported your career choices, even when we didn't understand them. Supported them? You spent Thanksgiving dinner laughing about my $20,000 salary. You called my work noble but impractical. Kevin literally asked if I had a plan or if I was just going to live on good intentions forever. We were concerned about your financial security, Kevin said defensively. Turns out that concern was misplaced, but it came from a good place. Did it? Or did it come from embarrassment that your sister wasn't successful in ways you could brag about to your friends? The question hung in the air like smoke. Nobody answered immediately, which was answer enough. Brittany was the first to break the silence. Okay, maybe we weren't as supportive as we should have been. But Diana, you have to understand how confusing this is. You let us worry about you while you were actually doing better than any of us. That feels deceptive. I was protecting my privacy and my peace of mind. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you were testing us, seeing how we'd treat you when we thought you were unsuccessful. It was a perceptive observation, one that I wasn't entirely comfortable examining. Had I been unconsciously testing them? Had some part of me wanted to see how they'd react to my apparent failure? Maybe I was, I admitted. And maybe you failed that test. Tom Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. This family dynamic. Discussion is important, but it's separate from the financial planning opportunities we should be considering. Diana, regardless of past communication issues, your current situation presents significant possibilities for everyone involved. What if I'm not interested in those possibilities? Then you're leaving money on the table, Dad said bluntly. Diana, you're smart enough to build substantial wealth on your own, but you're not thinking strategically about protecting and growing that wealth long term. What makes you think I'm not thinking strategically? Because you're still working. At a nonprofit for $20,000 a year, Kevin said. Because you're living in a tiny apartment and driving an old car. Because you're not leveraging your success into bigger opportunities. What if those choices are strategic? What if I'm working at TechForward because the mission matters to me, not because I need the salary? What if I'm living modestly because I prefer to invest my money rather than spend it on status symbols? Then you're thinking like someone who's never had real money before, Tom Morrison said with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Wealth management isn't about status symbols. It's about optimization, growth, and protection. I stood up abruptly, feeling claustrophobic in the room full of people who were so certain they knew what was best for me and my money. I need some air, I said, heading toward the back door. The evening was cool and quiet, with the kind of clear sky that made the mountains visible even from Lakewood. I sat on the back steps and pulled out my phone, scrolling through messages from Marcus and updates from my financial advisors. FlowPay's user base had grown by 15% in the past week. My cryptocurrency portfolio had gained another $50,000 while I'd been sitting in family meetings. TechForward had just received approval for a major federal grant that would expand our educational programming into 3 new states. All of these things were happening while my family was inside, debating how to manage my wealth more effectively. The back door opened behind me and Mom stepped out with 2 cups of tea. "Thought you might want something warm," she said, settling beside me on the steps. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching neighbors' windows light up as families settled in for the evening. It felt like the first peaceful moment we'd shared in months. "I'm proud of you," Mom said finally. "I know I haven't said that enough, but I am. What you've built is impressive. Thank you." I'm also confused and a little hurt. Not about the money specifically, but about feeling like you didn't trust us enough to share what was happening in your life. I sipped my tea, considering how to explain something I wasn't entirely sure I understood myself. It wasn't about trust exactly. It was about space. Every time I shared good news, it got absorbed into family planning discussions. Every time I shared challenges, they became evidence that I needed guidance or intervention. I needed room to figure things out on my own terms. And now? Now I'm not sure anything has changed. Dad and Tom are in there calculating the tax benefits of treating my assets as part of the family portfolio. Kevin is thinking about joint investment opportunities. Brittany is probably wondering if my success makes her look less successful by comparison. Mom was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe we deserve that assessment," Maybe we haven't been the kind of family that makes it easy to share success. You haven't been the kind of family that makes it easy to share failure either. No, she agreed softly. We haven't. We finished our tea as the sky darkened and the first stars became visible. When we finally went back inside, the living room had transformed into an impromptu business meeting. Tom Morrison had spread more documents across the coffee table, and Dad was taking notes on a legal pad while Kevin looked up something on his phone. "Diana," Dad said as we returned. "Tom was just explaining some trust structures that could significantly reduce your tax burden while providing benefits for the whole family." I looked at the papers scattered across the table, detailed proposals for managing wealth that I'd accumulated without their help or input. The presumption was breathtaking and also somehow perfectly predictable. "What if I said no?" I asked. "What if I said I want to keep managing my own finances and making my own decisions about my money?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise them. Tom Morrison looked up from his documents with the expression of someone who couldn't quite process what he'd just heard. "Why would you want to do that?" he asked. "Diana, individual wealth management is inherently less efficient than coordinated family strategies. You'd be choosing to pay more taxes and accept lower returns just to maintain independence that doesn't actually benefit you." Maybe the independence does benefit me. How? Maybe I like making decisions based on my own values instead of optimizing for maximum financial return. Maybe I like supporting causes I care about without having to justify those choices to a family investment committee. Dad set down his pen and looked at me with something that might have been disappointment. "Diana, this isn't about control or committee decisions. This is about smart financial management, about building something that benefits everyone instead of just hoarding individual wealth." Hoarding? I just donated $500,000 to TechForward to keep it operational. I'm funding FlowPay's development entirely out of my own pocket. I'm planning to invest in financial inclusion technologies that could help underbanked populations access digital services. How is any of that hoarding? "Those are all admirable projects," Tom Morrison said diplomatically. "But they could be even more effective with proper planning and family coordination. Charitable giving, for example, can provide significant tax benefits when structured correctly through family foundations. What if I don't want tax benefits? What if I just want to give money to organizations I believe in without turning it into a tax optimization strategy?" The room fell silent again, but this silence felt different. This was the quiet of people realizing that someone they thought they understood was operating according to completely different principles than they'd assumed. Kevin broke the silence first. "Diana, I don't understand why you're being so resistant to this. We're trying to help you make smart decisions about serious money." "Are you trying to help me make smart decisions, or are you trying to help yourselves access smart money?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Nobody answered immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about their motivations. Finally, Tom Morrison closed his portfolio and looked at me with professional patience. "Diana, I think you need some time to consider these opportunities. Wealth management decisions shouldn't be made in the heat of family discussions. Why don't I leave these materials with you, and we can schedule a follow-up meeting next week when everyone has had time to process the information?" I looked around the room one more time, at these people who shared my history but not my values, who wanted to manage my success but had never supported my struggles. "I don't think that will be necessary," I said quietly. "But thank you for the consultation." I gathered my purse and headed toward the front door, leaving behind a room full of people who were finally beginning to understand that having money didn't mean I was going to let them manage it. 3 months after walking out of my parents' house, I stood in the conference room of Morrison Partners watching Sarah Morrison sign the documents that would officially close FlowPay's Series A funding round. The investment was smaller than we could have taken, but it was exactly the right size to maintain control while gaining the strategic partnerships we needed for rapid growth. Marcus sat across from me at the polished conference table, grinning like someone who'd just won the lottery. In a sense, he had. Our platform was being valued at $12 million pre-money, which meant his 50% stake was worth more than most people earned in a decade. But more than the financial windfall, I could see his excitement about what we were building together. "Congratulations," Sarah said, shaking both our hands with the firm grip of someone who meant business. FlowPay has the potential to reshape how creators monetize digital content. We're excited to be part of that journey. The signing was followed by champagne and congratulations from the Morrison Partners team, but I found myself thinking about the people who weren't there to celebrate with us. My family had learned about the funding round through Kevin's industry contacts, the same way they'd discovered FlowPay's existence in the first place. Mom had called twice in the past week, leaving voicemails that started with congratulations and ended with invitations to family dinner. I hadn't returned those calls. After the celebratory meeting, Marcus and I walked to a quiet cafe near downtown Denver, the same place where we'd first discussed becoming business partners. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, and the familiar sound of coffee machines and quiet conversation provided a comfortable backdrop for processing what had just happened. "So we're officially millionaires now," Marcus said, stirring sugar into his espresso. "On paper, anyway." "How does it feel?" "Surreal. 6 months ago, I was working for someone else's startup, building other people's ideas. Now we have a platform that processes millions of micropayments per month and a team of 12 employees who believe in what we're creating." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The transition from individual contributor to business owner had been gradual but profound. Every hire, every product decision, every strategic partnership had reinforced the reality that we were building something larger than ourselves. "Any regrets about turning down the larger funding offers?" "None," I said without hesitation. Maintaining control was worth more than the extra capital. We can grow at our own pace, make decisions based on long-term value instead of quarterly returns. Marcus raised his espresso cup in a mock toast. "To smart money and patient capital. To partnership and shared vision." As we sat there celebrating, my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Williams at TechForward. "Congratulations on the FlowPay funding. Coffee this week to discuss something exciting?" I showed Marcus the message, and he smiled knowingly. Patricia had been following FlowPay's development from the beginning, understanding better than most how someone could be passionate about both nonprofit work and commercial technology. "She probably wants to discuss some kind of partnership," Marcus said. "TechForward's educational focus could be perfect for testing some of the platform features we've been developing." That meeting with Patricia took place 2 days later in her office at TechForward, surrounded by whiteboards covered in user experience diagrams and educational technology frameworks. She looked energized in a way I hadn't seen since the early days after my anonymous donation had stabilized the organization's funding. "Diana, I have a proposition for you," she said, pouring coffee from the machine that had become central to all our important conversations. "What would you think about TechForward launching a technology incubator focused on educational innovation?" The idea was intriguing and ambitious. TechForward had built credibility in the education space, but an incubator would require different expertise and significantly more capital than typical nonprofit operations. "Tell me more about the vision." Patricia pulled out a folder thick with research and planning documents. "There are dozens of entrepreneurs working on educational technology solutions, but most of them struggle to find funding that understands the social impact component. Traditional venture capital wants massive returns and rapid scaling. Educational technology often requires patient capital and deep understanding of how schools and teachers actually work." She was describing exactly the kind of funding gap that someone with my resources and experience could help fill. Educational technology needed investors who cared about impact as much as returns, who understood that sustainable change in education happened gradually rather than through disruptive innovation. What role would you envision for me? Officially, advisor and strategic partner. Unofficially, someone who could help us identify promising projects and provide the kind of business expertise that most nonprofit leaders lack. Patricia didn't know about my anonymous donation to TechForward, but she understood my commitment to the organization's mission. And after watching FlowPay's development process, she'd seen firsthand how I approached business strategy and product development. This sounds like something I'd want to be involved with, I said, but it would need to be structured carefully. Educational technology incubation requires different approaches than typical startup acceleration. We spent 2 hours discussing models for impact-focused incubators, analyzing what had worked in other markets, and what unique advantages TechForward could bring to educational entrepreneurs. By the end of the conversation, I was genuinely excited about the possibility of combining my business experience with TechForward's educational expertise. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing Patricia's proposal documents and thinking about legacy and purpose. FlowPay was generating serious revenue and solving real problems for content creators. TechForward was using my funding to expand educational programming into underserved communities. Both projects were creating measurable impact while building sustainable business models. But I was also thinking about the conversation I hadn't had with my family, the relationship dynamics I'd been avoiding since walking out of that wealth management discussion 3 months earlier. My phone rang while I was making dinner. Brittany's contact photo appeared on the screen, and I debated letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won over avoidance, and I answered. "Diana, we need to talk." Her tone was different from our usual conversations, more serious and less performative than the voice she used for family gatherings or social media content. About what? About this weird standoff we've been having since your big revelation. About the fact that you've been avoiding family events for 3 months. About mom crying after every voicemail you don't return. I set down my cooking utensils and moved to the living room, recognizing that this was going to be a longer conversation than I'd expected. I haven't been avoiding anything. I've been busy building a business and managing the responsibilities that come with it. Diana, you closed a $6 million funding round and didn't tell your own family. That's not being busy. That's making a statement. She wasn't wrong. The funding announcement had been covered in several Denver business publications, and I'd deliberately not shared the news with my parents or siblings. It was passive-aggressive behavior, but it was also self-protective. What statement do you think I was making? That you don't consider us part of your success. That you'd rather celebrate with business partners than with the people who raised you and supported you. Supported me? Brittany, you spent Thanksgiving dinner laughing about my salary and questioning my life choices. Kevin asked if I had any plan besides living on good intentions. Dad invited his business partner to a family meeting to discuss managing my wealth without asking if I was comfortable with that. There was silence on Brittany's end, and I could hear her processing the accuracy of my observations. Okay, maybe we handled things badly when we first found out about FlowPay. But Diana, you have to understand how shocking it was. You let us think you were struggling financially while you were actually building serious wealth. I was protecting my privacy and my peace of mind. I didn't owe you complete transparency about my business activities. Maybe not legally, but families share important news with each other, especially news that changes everything about how we understand your situation. I walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the Denver skyline where lights were beginning to twinkle in office buildings and apartment complexes. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably working late on FlowPay development. Patricia was likely reviewing applications for educational technology grants. Sarah Morrison was analyzing market opportunities for her next investment. All of these people were part of my professional life in ways that felt meaningful and supportive. But my family relationships remained complicated and conditional, based on expectations and assumptions that I'd never agreed to accept. Brittany, What do you want from this conversation? I want us to figure out how to be a family again. I want you to come to Mom's birthday dinner next week. I want us to celebrate your success instead of fighting about how you handled telling us about it. And what would that celebration look like? Would Dad and Tom Morrison have new wealth management proposals ready? Would Kevin have investment opportunities that require my capital? Would you want to discuss how my success affects your personal brand? Another long silence. When Brittany spoke again, her voice was quieter, less confident. Maybe we deserve that. Maybe we've been thinking about your money more than your happiness. Maybe? Okay, definitely. We've been thinking about your money more than your happiness. But Diana, that doesn't mean we don't care about you. It means we're not used to anyone in the family having the kind of resources that change everything. It was the most honest thing any of my family members had said to me in months. I could hear genuine regret in Brittany's voice, the kind of vulnerability that she rarely showed even in private conversations. What would change look like? I asked. No more family financial planning meetings. No more suggestions about how you should be managing your wealth. No more assumptions about what your success means for the rest of us. And in exchange, you come back to family events. You share good news when you want to share it, not because we pressure you. You let us be proud of you without making it about money. It was a reasonable offer, more reasonable than I'd expected from any of my family members. But it was also just the beginning of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and different values. I'll think about it, I said. Mom's birthday is next Sunday. Just family, no business partners, no wealth management discussions. Just cake and embarrassing stories and the kind of normal family celebration we should have had for your business success. After we hung up, I sat on my couch thinking about forgiveness and boundaries, about the difference between reconciliation and returning to dysfunctional patterns. My family's conditional support had hurt, but their genuine surprise at my success had also revealed something important about their assumptions and limitations. They weren't malicious people. They were conventional people who measured success in conventional ways, who struggled to understand choices that didn't fit their framework for how smart, capable people should behave. The following Sunday, I drove to Lakewood with a birthday, gift for Mom, and realistic expectations about family dynamics. The house looked the same as always, but the atmosphere felt different when I walked in. Less formal, more genuinely welcoming than the last time I'd been there. Mom hugged me longer than usual, and I could see relief in her expression. Dad shook my hand and said congratulations on the FlowPay funding without segueing into investment advice. Kevin asked about the business with genuine curiosity rather than competitive assessment. Brittany had clearly briefed everyone on the new ground rules for family interactions, and they were all making visible efforts to treat me like a daughter and sister rather than a financial planning opportunity. During dinner, conversation flowed, more naturally than it had in months. We talked about Mom's volunteer work with the Library Foundation, Dad's plans for semi-retirement, Kevin's upcoming vacation to Europe. Normal family topics that didn't require anyone to perform success or defend life choices. After cake, I found myself alone with Dad in the kitchen while he was loading the dishwasher. The domestic scene felt surreal after months of tension and formal meetings. "Diana, I owe you an apology," he said without looking up from the plates he was rinsing. "I let my excitement about your success overshadow my pride in your accomplishments. I started thinking like a financial planner instead of like your father. Thank you for saying that. I want you to know that I've always been proud of you, even when I didn't understand your choices. The work you do at TechForward matters, even if it doesn't pay well. The business you built with Marcus is impressive, regardless of how much money it makes." It was the validation I'd been wanting to hear for years, offered without conditions or caveats about how I should be leveraging my success differently. I appreciate that, Dad. And I'm sorry for shutting you out instead of trying to explain. Why your approach felt overwhelming? We finished cleaning the kitchen in comfortable silence, the kind of peaceful coexistence that I'd forgotten was possible with my family. Driving home that evening, I felt something that had been missing. For months. Not excitement exactly, but contentment. The sense that the different parts of my life could coexist without constant conflict or explanation. FlowPay was thriving under Marcus's technical leadership and my business strategy. TechForward was expanding its educational programming with sustainable funding and innovative partnerships. My family relationships were healing through honest communication and adjusted expectations, and I was finally living authentically, making decisions based on my own values rather than other people's assumptions about what success should look like. 2 weeks later, I signed the paperwork to officially launch TechForward's educational technology incubator with myself as lead advisor and primary funder. The announcement generated interest from educational entrepreneurs across the region, people who shared my belief that technology could solve real problems when it was developed with genuine understanding of user needs. Marcus joined the incubator's advisory board, bringing FlowPay's experience with payment processing and user experience design. Patricia recruited 2 additional staff members with backgrounds in educational research and startup operations. Within a month, we had applications from 15 educational technology projects, ranging from literacy apps for elementary students to career preparation platforms for community college students. I spent my days reviewing business plans and financial projections, conducting due diligence interviews, and helping entrepreneurs refine their market strategies. It was work that combined my business expertise with my commitment to social impact, creating value that couldn't be measured purely in financial returns. Marcus and I still collaborated on FlowPay development, but our partnership had evolved beyond just business collaboration. We'd become friends who trusted each other's judgment and supported each other's goals, building something sustainable that benefited everyone involved. My family had learned to celebrate my success without trying to manage it, offering support and pride without conditions or expectations about how I should be living differently. And I'd learned that authentic success meant building the life I actually wanted rather than the life that looked most impressive to other people. 6 months after that first family confrontation about my secret wealth, I stood in my new office at TechForward's expanded headquarters, looking out at downtown Denver and thinking about impact and purpose. My investment portfolio continued, growing steadily, but the numbers mattered less than what I was building with that capital. Educational entrepreneurs were developing solutions that would help thousands of students learn more effectively. Content creators were earning sustainable income through FlowPay's micropayment platform. TechForward was reaching underserved communities with technology that actually addressed their needs. I'd built a life where financial success enabled social impact, where business expertise created opportunities for meaningful work, where family relationships were based on mutual respect rather than conditional support. It wasn't the life my family had envisioned for me, but it was exactly the life I'd chosen for myself. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.